Thoughts by Brad and Gary.
Hello and welcome to the Not Ready for Primetime Project. We're Gary Seath and Brad Robinson.
And you're not.
This week, we're talking about a brand new biography that comes out today titled Lorne, the Man Who Invented Saturday Night Live. And we are joined by the author of the book, former editor-in-chief of the New York Observer, one of the original editors of Spy magazine, and currently the articles editor for the New Yorker, Susan Morrison. Welcome to the show.
Welcome.
Hi, very nice to be here.
Thank you for joining us. And thank you. This book is outstanding.
Amazing.
Well, thank you for saying that. I devoted many years of my life to it.
Before we get into the book, I just wanted to talk about your relationship with the show, Saturday Night Live. You've been a fan since day one, the very beginning, yes?
Definitely. I was in 10th grade when the show debuted, and like every suburban kid with a basement, I watched it avidly, probably getting stoned with my friends. We had never seen anything like it. And I really lucked out. In May of that first season, a good friend of mine had an aunt who was a secretary at NBC, and she got us tickets. So we took the Metro North train into the city, made our way to Rockefeller Center, and I sat right next to home base for one of the classic episodes of that season. It was Elliot Gould. The musical guest was Leon Redbone.
Yeah.
Of course.
And, I sat there, and of course I had watched the show, but I loved it. But what really impressed me, even more than the comedy itself, I'm sure I was too dorky and young to get plenty of the references on Weekend Update. What I really remember was just the craziness of sitting right in the middle of a working television studio, cameras on cranes flying over your head, people changing costume in the corner of the studio, people hustling in scenery flats. You're really right in the middle of it. And when you're watching at home, you don't quite get the sense that, this is like deconstructed theater. And that was so cool. And so let's see, I guess about 8 years later, really by just a kind of serendipitous turn of events, I found myself working as an assistant on the new show, which was a primetime comedy hour that Lorne produced for NBC during the 5 years when he was kind of on hiatus from SNL. After the 5th season, he walked away from it. He thought the SNL chapter of his life was over, and he wanted to direct movies. When that didn't go so well, he went back to NBC and did this primetime hour. I didn't know it at the time, but one of the things that was unusual about that is I had a front row seat to Lorne's one spectacular public failure. So was a complete bust. He lost hundreds of thousands of dollars of his own money every week. But that was an interesting thing to watch. And I also, I was working with the writers there, and I met a lot of the greats. I was Jim Downey's assistant, but George Meyer, who went on to The Simpsons, the great Jack Handy, Steve Martin, so many of these people, I stayed friends with, and they wrote for me over the years at the other places I worked. And I, because I made a lot of friends there, I kind of was in the orbit of the show for the next decades. I would come see the show every now and then. And it's not as if Lorne and I were friends by any stretch, but we knew each other and would say hi. And, in later years, I think our teenage daughters traveled to the same circle. So kind of vaguely stayed in touch. Another funny, just sort of, life connection to the show is that my boyfriend, Loudon Wainwright, was on the first season as a musical guest. He was on the show when the week that ABBA was on. And so Loudon was able to be a great source in the book for some of the doings of that crazy week, including the fact that everybody that week spent almost all their time trying to figure out whether the ABBA girls were wearing underpants or not.
Heard that story, yeah.
Oh, that's amazing. So how then were you able to put this entire project together and approach Lorne and, kind of pitch it to him, I guess?
I'd say about 10 years ago, the SNL 40th anniversary had just happened. That was a great show, I thought. And I, at the same time, was about to become an empty nester. And I had the preposterous idea that meant that I was going to have a lot of free time. Not quite true. But I started thinking about how Lorne would be a really great subject. And, it was so clear that the show the show was just so important in American culture. And really, no one more than Lorne Michaels has kind of determined and created the things that make Americans laugh for 40 years at that time. So I thought, well, maybe I can write a book. And I wrote a book proposal. I had an agent send it around. I was a little bit surprised at the interest. There was a big bidding war. People really wanted to do it. I had not approached Lorne about this because I knew that I could do it with or without his participation, given the connections I, had in his world. I ended up signing with Random House, and I thought, geez, I guess I really have to write this book. So then I emailed Lorne and I said, I'd love to come over and see you. So I showed up in his office one day and I just said, listen, I just wanted to let you know I've just signed a deal with Random House to write a book about you and the show. And, I don't need anything from you. I know a lot of your people. I'm conversant in this world, but it would be a much richer and better book if you wanted to talk to me and participate in it. And, I didn't really know what to expect because Lorne had spent the previous 40 years staying pretty much out of the frame. He's a pretty private person. He only talks to the press, I think, under duress, when he really has something that needs to be promoted. But I think a handful of things went into him agreeing. One, he was feeling a little bit sentimental after the 40th, and I think he was thinking about his legacy. He was aware so many people had died before the 70s. You could feel some of it slipping away. So I think that motivated him. I do think also, he liked and respected me. He loves the New Yorker.
Right.
I think he thought if somebody was going to do this better me than, kind of a quickie entertainment hack, but he's superstitious in a sweet way. I think that the fact, I told him that I had been at that Elliot Gould show in 1976. That was a show that was very, very meaningful for him. He really thought the show really came together that episode. And I think that sparked something. And another thing, and so now I'm getting really nerdy and abstruse, is that in the very beginning, the New Yorker writer Lillian Ross and William Shawn, who was the editor of the magazine, they were huge comedy fans. A lot of people don't know this. Shawn's favorite movie toward the end of his life was This Is Spinal Tap. Oh. They came to the show, the first season, met Lorne, took him under their wing, kind of showed him around, introduced him to people. And this was enormously important to Lorne, who didn't know New York City. He was basically a provincial guy from Canada, the son of a furrier. So to meet these very sophisticated New York people who loved his show and wanted to show him the ropes was important. Anyway, when I went to the New Yorker in 1997, I became Lillian's editor, and we were very, very close. Backtrack. Lillian set out in the beginning to write a big New Yorker profile of Lorne. She worked on it for a long, long time. And then before she got to write it, William Shawn was fired as the editor of the magazine. So she quit. The profile never happened. And I think that when I showed up in a kind of superstitious way, Lorne viewed this as perhaps me picking up the thread of her uncompleted project. So there are a lot of sort of beautiful kismet angles to it. I found it very moving that he wanted to be involved. So that day I talked to him in his office. At first he looked kind of like, what? Because it's just not the kind of thing you'd ever have considered doing. And he said, well, let me give it some thought. And so a few days later, we met for a drink. And basically, he just started talking. He just started telling stories. And he loves to tell stories. He has so much to say. He has a Forrest Gump kind of life. He's been every place from, laugh in when Richard Nixon appeared and said, "Sock it to me." And, he testified at Keith Richards' heroin trial. He's been everywhere. So, he just decided to talk, and we made no deal. He had no power or veto power or anything over what I wrote. I think he was smart enough to recognize that what was going to come out of this was a real book, a real journalistic book, not a vanity project. And he just went with it. And we had the times, the evenings I spent talking to him in his office were so fun. We had a nice rapport. It was great.
Yeah, you can feel it in the book. Like his involvement just adds so much to those stories. And especially one of the things I found so intriguing in the book is the structure in which you laid it out. So for people who don't know, so the book's laid out in 6 sections, kind of days of the week, and Monday through Saturday. And with the start of each of those sections being the start of that day. And it's like it's 2 stories in one, where not only do you tell Lorne's story, but through that structure, you're actually following the life of an actual show that week. It's the Jonah Hill's 5th time hosting. I just wondered how you came across that idea of how to tell the story in that manner.
Yeah, it's the technical term for that is it's a braided narrative. But I'll tell you how I wasn't thinking about that at the beginning, but I had been talking to Lorne for a couple of years, and I'd been interviewing a lot of other people, and I'd never written a biography. And I started to realize 2 things. Okay, you're writing about SNL, or 40 odd seasons, you want to make sure that for the reader, it doesn't just feel like a kind of a death march through the years. 88 turned into 89, turned into 90. I realized that I wanted some variety. And I also knew that many readers of the book were just going to be fans of the show. And part of the great, the miracle of SNL and the mystique of it is simply how the damn thing gets done every week. I also really admire this, kind of up close in the room reporting, the kind that Lillian Ross and so many of the New Yorker writers that I edit excel at. So I thought, I'd love, I said to Lorne after that summer, I guess of 2018, I said, I have amazing material from you and everybody else already, but what I think would really be great is if I could just embed at the show for a week and watch everything and see how it all happens and make that really vivid for readers. And I'll say I was kind of surprised that he agreed. And I know that a lot of these meetings, it's really sensitive. There are personalities and sharp elbows. And I knew that people would have to be candid in these meetings. I mean, we have this at the New Yorker. We just had a film crew in working on a documentary about us. And, when you're in a meeting, you want to watch what you say when there's a journalist there. So I made the only deal that we ever made is that I said, I'll sit through everything. And, he let me be in even one-on-one meetings between him and Jonah. I was there all the time. I said, if at the end of every day, there's anything that happened or that anyone said that you feel crosses a line or exposes somebody or is needlessly cruel, or just let me know and we can agree that can be off the record. But I was there every day that week. He never did. Every single thing that happened was up for grabs and on the record. And, I sat there on the couch with my tape recorder and my notepad, and people trust Lorne. They knew that he had given this a green light, and I just watched it all on spool. And you're right. That really gives the book a kind of propulsion that it wouldn't have if you just started in 1944.
Yeah, it's fascinating, especially not expecting it, and you kind of going back and forth, and you realize, oh, okay, now we're going to follow both the show and Lorne. Yeah. It was so exciting.
Well, what I especially liked, because you don't really get this from anecdotes, is just to watch his particular management skills. He has a kind of internal jujitsu that he deploys with all the different egos swirling around him, and watching him in the room with these people where, he has to sort of tamp down on this one and motivate that one and keep everybody going, watching the subtle political dynamics. So in a way, the book is a workplace comedy, like The Office, get to know all these people and they're all trying to push their agenda. Some prevail and some don't. And, I often say that watching the show come together during the week, it's like the Hunger Games, right? You begin Wednesday with 4 hours worth of material. And by the time Saturday night comes, it's winnowed down to like 7 or 8 sketches.
Yeah. And it's a really nice way, as you're telling the story of current day Saturday Night Live, you weave it into the story of Lorne, and you kind of see these building blocks of the show and really how Lorne has been influenced throughout his life. I think one of the things that really caught me was reading about Lorne putting on these shows at summer camps, the fast shows, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And that to me was just kind of like, oh, he was a producer at 13, 14 years old. He's producing these things.
Right. One of the things that surprised me I remember when I took this on, one of my colleagues at the New Yorker said, "Oh, is this going to be a short pants biography?" And I didn't know what that meant. But what he meant was, are you going to start with Lorne as a child, and bring him up to now, or are you going to start with the creation of SNL? And again, I didn't really know, but then when I started reporting, I went to Toronto, I talked to Lorne's old schoolmates, and of course he talked about his childhood too. I realized it's kind of an uncanny way. He lived this life all the years up to SNL. I mean, it's almost like Pip in Great Expectations or something. Everything he did actually played into, you could see him, year by year acquiring the skills that he would eventually use to create SNL. Whether it was, at camp, figuring out what somebody could do on stage in the camp show, or in college when he did the UC Follies, one thing. And it's so pure Lorne. It's the kind of thing he would do today. He was auditioning for his college show. This kid comes in with Coke bottle glasses. He couldn't do anything with any of the sketches that Lorne wrote. When he auditioned with those, he was terrible. And actually, this is the first thing that Lorne ever wrote that to me seemed really funny, even though it's, kind of childish, is for that show at the University of Toronto, there was a Shakespeare pastiche, a Shakespeare parody. And one of the characters in it, and Lorne wrote this, is named Hand in Bra, which is, instead of Fortinbras, but Hand in Bra, which, I mean, what a perfect thing for a teenage boy in the 1950s to come up with, right? So this guy, Earl Pomerantz, auditioned, but he just, he said he bombed. But what Earl was good at was just doing comic monologues. And so this Earl Pomerantz's big brother, who was a law school student, who had actually had some experience as a professional comedy writer, calls Lorne and says, "Listen, please cast my kid brother. He really wants to be in your show." So Lorne basically made a deal that he'd cast the kid brother if Hart Pomerantz would contribute some, actual good comedy material to the show. And that's, it's that kind of wheeling and dealing and pulling levers that Lorne is a genius at. And the idea that he was figuring out how to do it as a college student is interesting.
Yeah, it's fascinating, really. I think, Pip from Great Expectations, you called him Forrest Gump earlier. He really does have that life where Lorne's father dies when he's 14, and you talk about how he's kind of looking for a father figure, and he finds it in some ways in his uncle Pep Levy, and then in other ways he finds it in Frank Schuster, who he just happens to go to school with Frank Schuster's daughter.
Yeah, that is right out of Dickens, isn't it? Yeah, she's an Estelle character, right? Yeah, he lives a couple blocks away from the daughter of Canada's biggest comedy star. And not only is Lorne really interested in comedy, but he doesn't have a father, He's lost his father, so he starts spending every day after school in the Schuster's den, listening to Frank Schuster teach him about how the Marx Brothers jokes work, what's the key to the Jack Benny pause, telling him old showbiz stories about the Mankowitzes. And it really, you can't imagine a more perfect preparation for the life that he would go on to lead.
And then Frank Schuster really helps him guide his career and is a mentor to him in many ways too, which is just phenomenal. And it shows how Lorne was so immersed in that and absorbed everything. And he just seemed like a sponge.
Yes. I mean, the interesting thing, though, is that Frank Schuster, like all smart people in show business, told Lorne, don't go into show business, go to law school, because everyone in show business knows how perilous it is. And I think it's kind of interesting that later on, a few years later, when he finally gets to New York, Lorne befriends Paul Simon and they become like best friends, and they're still best friends. And Paul Simon, just like Lorne, grew up in this provincial family of second generation Jews. And, he was supposed to go to law school. I think Paul Simon even went to a semester of law school before dropping out. And Lorne's mother expected him to go to law school too. So, he basically dodged law school and ended up in showbiz.
Not surprisingly, a good portion of the book is dedicated to the creation of SNL, the months leading up to it in those first 5 seasons, which is my favorite part of the show's history. And I've loved reading about it. And what I really loved reading about that particular point in time in your book is how little tidbits and anecdotes are thrown in that I love to just catch that, like, it's almost like name dropping, but not, because it flows so well. Stuff like, without trying to give too much away, like Jim Downey interviewing for his job in the stands while the band is rehearsing on stage, or John Belushi stealing host limos after the after party to go around all night. And my personal favorite, which I had never heard, was Bernie Brillstein's involvement in the Billy Crystal situation.
Yeah.
I laughed out loud when I read that those couple that story. About that era, I had to ask you, how difficult was it getting stories like that? Like, how good were people's memories 40 years back in the day, or were you relying on kind of older text, or how did you? Because there's so much richness in those stories.
A handful of those stories might have come from the Miller and Shales oral history, but really, people. The thing is, if you think about when Lorne hires you, whether it was in the 70s or now, these people were very young. It changed their lives. It opened the world to them. So if you're Jim Downey, you show up there in your little seersucker suit. He had hardly any idea what the show was because he hadn't watched the first season. He had been on a fellowship in Europe. But you're sitting there talking to this mild-mannered guy, and 10 feet away, the band is playing. I mean, he said it was just all he could do to not have his brain explode. He was so excited. So people remember those moments, But it is true that I talked to a lot of people. I remember calling Barry Diller on the phone to try to get him to confirm some stuff about working on the Lily Tomlin specials that Lorne produced for Lily. And he just said, oh my God, it was the 70s. Are you kidding? Expect me to remember. Other, prodded. I mean, people did remember. No, I mean, I think that going to work for that show is so life-changing for so many people that they do really remember. There are definitely things that Lorne was fuzzy about. Like sometimes he'd say, ask Edie Baskin, or why don't you see, ask Jane Rose, who's Keith Richards' longtime assistant. It was really fun digging back to that. But one of the things that I found, to go back to your initial question about how interesting just the creation of the first show and the first season was, a biggest revelation to me was how once he was offered the job by NBC, Lorne had been living in Los Angeles, in Malibu, and also at the Chateau Marmont, or Marmont, as he calls it. It's good French. He didn't want to come to New York. He really was digging California, and he almost said no because he had suddenly a screenwriting job. And I just didn't know that he wrestled so much with the idea of coming to New York. That was right at the time, New York was on the verge of bankruptcy. Crime was at a high, there was a garbage strike. It was cold.
Mm-hmm.
He had left Canada and liked wearing Hawaiian shirts. I thought that was fascinating, that the show almost didn't happen because Lorne Michaels wanted to stay in California. And of course, once he got to New York, he, like so many people, was beguiled by it, and he immediately took to it. I mean, of course, meeting, and he kind of went around and, again, like Forrest Gump, just met, sort of the mayors of New York. He met, Mike Nichols and Woody Allen and William Shawn and Lillian Ross and Candice Bergen, and Jan Wenner was an important early friend of his in New York City.
Yeah, it is interesting stories, the way you talk about New York City at the time. And to your point, you were just talking about how people weren't flocking to New York City like they do now, like they think it's such a great place now. Like it really was kind of a scrappy, build yourself up kind of place. And it was fun to kind of follow almost New York's growth this time as well,
Yes.
as along with the show and with Lorne. Yeah.
Well, that's such an interesting point. I mean, well, first of all, Lorne also had some great lines about New York. Like he said, New York was the Ramones, Los Angeles was Jackson Browne and the Eagles. Not that he's a big Eagles fan, but it was a more easygoing way of life. And he would say LA was, people painting vans with psychedelic colors. New York was people sitting in a basement reading the Tibetan Book of the Dead. He just thought it was really pretentious and dull. But it's also really interesting, as you just said, that the way the show kind of tracks the ups and downs of New York. The very first home base set for the show that Eugene Lee built was a really looked like a dingy village basement nightclub. The walls were peeling paint and there was an old pressed tin ceiling. And that was New York in the 70s. But as I really got into the reporting, I started noticing that every time the set got updated, by the time you're in the 80s, the go-go 80s with all the junk bond kings and the rich ladies in their poof skirts. And, when New York had turned around again, suddenly there were crystal chandeliers in the set. New York was
Right.
kind of spiffing itself up. So the show sort of tracked that.
Oh, absolutely. When you're working on a book that spans 80 years, we talked about all of the people that you were able to talk to and, friends of Lorne's growing up and everything. Were there people that you just weren't able to talk to, either that were no longer with us or that just didn't want to talk?
Well, I felt very lucky that I had a great interview with Buck Henry a couple of years before he died. And I knew Buck from the news show. And I'm so glad that I got to spend time with him. I spent a lot of time with the great Herb Schlosser, the visionary NBC president who dreamed up the idea of SNL in almost every particular. And I'm glad that I'm able to give him proper credit in this book. He died a couple of years ago. Definitely a few other people. Oh boy, I interviewed a few other people just in time. Their names are escaping me right now. But yes, I mean, I did. One person I didn't talk to was Dick Ebersol. And that was really just because when I called him, he was writing his own book. And people who are writing their own book want to kind of, hoard their memories. But then he beat me. So his book came out and I quoted a few things from his book and credited him. I did not encounter anyone. There's only one person who said no, and I bet he doesn't even know he said no because it was his publicist. Almost everybody I talked to, I was able to avoid the nightmare gauntlet of publicists because, first of all, people knew that Lorne was talking to me, so I think that made them feel that they were allowed to talk to me. And mostly, it was sort of this person would put me onto this person or put me onto that person. And I can tell you, at this day and age, just being able to email or call someone and not go through the whole torture that you have to go through with a million publicists. That was great. But one person who I didn't have a direct connection to was Andy Samberg. And I wanted to talk to him because of the importance of the digital shorts. And I think I was dealing with his publicist on some other New Yorker related story. And I said, oh, by the way, I'd love to talk to Andy Samberg for the book I'm writing. I've talked to absolutely everybody else and listed a million names. And she just got back to me and just said, I don't think he can do that. And now I actually feel kind of sorry for Andy Samberg. He's going to pick up this book and think, how come I'm the only guy not quoted in it? But you should fire the publicist.
When Andy Samberg listens to this podcast, he's going to be very disappointed.
Well, he can call me.
I'm so happy you got to speak with Buck. That's another one of my favorite little tidbits in the book is there's many times you mentioned Lorne telling stories, talking to people and telling them the same story over and over again. And there's an anecdote where they're out to dinner and Lorne starts telling some story he's told over and over again. And Buck Henry gets up and is like, I'm fucking out of here.
Yes.
It's great.
Buck was one of the rare people he was a kind of a senior statesman. The fact that he wrote The Graduate made him God in Lorne's eyes. When Lorne was a teenager, not a teenager, but when he was a young man, he saw The Graduate. And this was before he really had settled on comedy. Well, not that The Graduate isn't a comedy, but he said, that's what I want to do. I want to make a movie like that. And even when he left SNL after 5 seasons, I think he thought, okay, now I'm going to go make my version of The Graduate. He thought that was his calling. So when he met Buck Henry, I mean, that was, he learned a lot from Buck. One of the things he likes to say is, you could have made up a world of what I didn't know back then. Buck was the first person he ever met who read 3 newspapers, very well informed. He loved the fact that Buck Henry and Mike Nichols had been classmates back at Dalton. It was kind of an old, educated New York that appealed to Lorne. He wanted to be in that circle. So it was, I was too much of a munchkin at the news show to see this dynamic. But I think that as that show started to fail, I think that created some tension between Buck and Lorne, because Buck was one of the hosts and there was a feeling that maybe Lorne wasn't really all hands on deck enough. But I know that that created some tension between them. And that's, I think, when that restaurant story happened.
Yeah.
I don't want to hear about the motel at Laugh-In again. I'm leaving.
Yeah, I know. It's because it's one of the things too, as fans of the show, when we sit around and talk, we're always like, one of the things it's sad is that Buck wasn't a presence in the show when Lorne came back at all. Aside from showing up at the 15th anniversary, we never got to see Buck like pop in or do a cameo or anything. And it's we feel like a lot of newer fans don't recognize Buck Henry because of that as much.
Right. It's a shame. For years, it was a tradition that he would host the closing episode of the season. And there was just something so great about that. One of the things I loved learning, because I didn't know this, is that Buck, there were always sketches that would be written that were just too out there or too tasteless. Hosts would always say, I'm not doing that. Are you kidding me? But they'd save them for Buck and he would do them. I don't know if the Uncle Roy, the pervert babysitter, was one of those, but he would always just do them.
Yeah.
We refer to them as horny Buck sketches oftentimes.
There's something he told me that I think this made it into the book. I had to cut a lot for space because I wrote the book initially at twice the length. I had so much.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, Judd Apatow keeps bugging me for the director's cut.
I was just going to ask you for it. Yeah.
But Buck told me about once going up to a meeting in a boardroom full of executives and being made to explain this joke. And this is only audio, but basically the joke is, making a zero, an O with one hand and then putting your index finger through it, the adolescent boy semaphore for sex. And he had to sit there in a boardroom with all these guys in suits and explain that.
Everyone that you talk to throughout the years, do you see a difference in people who knew Lorne as a young man and met him when he was younger, as opposed to someone who met this kind of older, wiser person and kind of went into it with their own preconceptions of Lorne and see him as a father figure like he was trying to find?
Well, that's a good question. In the beginning, it was tricky for him. In the first 5 years, he was roughly the same age as his cast and writers. And I think he struggled a little bit with, how can I be the boss and be one of the boys? He didn't fire anybody in those first 5 years. And I think those people did see him as a peer, even though back then he had this quality that made people want to win his approval. But definitely as time went on, he did become kind of more of a father figure to these people. I mean, not only was he the person who was the ultimate decider about whether their material got on, but he was kind of a comedy guru. He talked in axioms and he had a lot of comedy rules and mysterious koans and, things that everybody always wanted to hear, but then wanted to puzzle out. His relative kind of remoteness fostered a feeling of people wanting to huddle and talk about him and decode him. And, he always had a kind of a Wizard of Oz like presence. I remember people talking about how, Chris Farley would get summoned to Lorne's office often to be lectured about drinking and taking drugs too much during the week. And for Farley, the exciting fact of being in Lorne's office one-on-one with him, that outweighed the fact that he was getting in trouble. It was sort of like being in the principal's office, but it was thrilling. So, yeah, I mean, some of the more Freudian, psychologically minded members of the staff actually started to think that, okay, he fosters this father figure thing, and then he withholds, sort of reenacting what happened to him as a child. I mean, who knows, that kind of transference thing, stuff like that. I'm sure if that kind of thing happens, it's unconscious, but he does like to, I definitely felt, certainly from the way he talked to me about his father's death and the effect it had on him, which was shattering, that in some way he's always been looking to kind of rebuild the family feeling. He's always looking for a tribe. And what he did with the show and has continued to do is to kind of create a culture, like an extended family, sort of with walls around it. And once you're in, you're in. A handful of people get cut off. And it's like something out of The Godfather. It's like kissing Fredo on both cheeks. They're out. And but he likes, as one of his old Toronto friends told me, he likes rabbit's feet. He likes to have familiar people around. And I think that, the father figure thing plays right into that. Aside from giving people wisdom and advice about how comedy works, it extends, especially as he's gotten older and wiser and richer, into giving people advice about how to live their lives. Jimmy Fallon told me that he would say, Lorne, should I be dating actresses or should I avoid actresses? And he'd give them dating advice. Or Kristen Wiig told me about how she would bring her boyfriend problems to him. But then he also, many people, I think, including David Spade, maybe Kevin Nealon, told me that he would always tell them that they should live beyond their means, that they should rent an apartment that they didn't think they could afford. Because then at the end of a hard day, they'd come home and they'd say, wow, who lives here? I do. But he talks about how a lot of the people who work for him, this is a great phrase, are first generation famous, meaning that, unlike Candice Bergen, who had a famous father, they're the first people in their family who have money and fame. So they can't ask their mom or dad advice about how to navigate this life. So they ask Lorne. And one of the things that he says about people who become famous fast, first of all, they almost always turn into an asshole for a little while, and he forgives them for that. But I think they're always afraid that it's all going to disappear. So he tries to be the one to reassure them, like, you're making this kind of money now, you're going to be making it next year and the year after too. That's why he says, when looking for an apartment, what's better than 10-foot ceilings? 12-foot ceilings. He urges people to go for it, which must be, think about what a powerful confidence boost that must be, right? He's telling them that they've made it and they don't have to cut corners and, choose the cheapest wine on the wine list. Right. And one thing that he said to me, I can't remember whether I got this in the book or not, but he said at a certain point, something clicked in him, and he realized that if on his deathbed, he thought about how he'd always ordered the second cheapest wine on the wine list. Like, would the savings really have been worth it? He's really a proponent of living the good life and going, taking a lot of vacations and wearing expensive shoes. And he doesn't, Tina Fey said something that I thought was brilliant, because he's different from a lot of show business moguls in this regard. He never had that 80s disease, that you see in people like Jeffrey Katzenberg or Barry Diller, where you read a story about them and they say, I get up at 4:00 every morning, spend an hour with my trainer, and, spend an hour looking at my stock portfolio. And, he doesn't brag about being a workaholic. He works very hard, but he takes his leisure time very seriously, and he counsels his people to do the same.
You mentioned older Lorne, Gary, you asked, and we spent a lot, not surprisingly, asking questions about early years, but the book, we should say, does cover almost up to present day. It goes through what you called the Trump bump during Trump's first term, and COVID as well. And those stories were really interesting. The whole dynamic of the show behind the scenes of having Trump on and people for and against that. And then I really found it interesting, which I didn't even know, that for the COVID shows, that when Lorne was doing all of that from St. Bart's, and just reading all of that was really fascinating too.
Yeah, I thought that the COVID shows that was really interesting. Not just that they managed to do it. One of Lorne always says, and this is something he learned from his Uncle Pep, that there's a tremendous value in just showing up. He shows up at funerals, he shows up at the bar mitzvahs of his kids' friends, and he, in the same way that the show came back after 9/11, when it did, showing up during COVID was important to him. And it was the first time in all of his years at the helm that he wasn't physically there. He was in St. Bart's, the borders were closed. He did not want to Zoom. He felt he was too old to take on a new technology. All of his very able deputies, Aaron Doyle, Steve Higgins, Eric Kenward, Carolyn Maroney, Che and Jost, they pulled most of the levers. They did most of it from New York. And he was very proud of them and quite good at delegating. They would check in with him by phone, but as I said, he would not get on the Zoom grid, And one of the things I find most interesting about that COVID episode is, to me, it provides a clue to this thing that everybody is obsessed with right now, which is, what's the succession plan?
Right.
Everyone is saying, will Lorne retire after the 50th? Who could replace him? Can anyone replace him? Will NBC stop the show? I thought that the COVID show was a really good demonstration of his powers to delegate. He has great deputies. He trusts them. They get his values. So that made me see or imagine an outcome that is different from the ones that you hear floated a lot. You hear a lot of people say, oh, Tina Fey could take it over, or Seth Meyers. But what I think is a likelier situation is that Lorne could come. There are 2 times in the week when his brain and his presence are completely essential. And those are Wednesday afternoon when the read through is done. The whole cast read through 4 hours worth of potential sketches. And then right after that, Lorne sits in his office with his deputies and they do what they call pick the show. They narrow it down to like 12 or 15 sketches that are going to go into production over the next few days. The next time he's really essential is Saturday at dress rehearsal, which begins at about 8:00. And he watches it from a little bunker under the bleachers, a little blacked out cubby hole where he watches on a monitor. So he sees just what the audience sees. And he's really seeing everything for the first time then since read through. And he's very decisive then. He barks notes and orders. A lot of them are about production issues. A lot of them are like, that lighting cue was off. You cut to a closed door. That wig is starring in the sketch. He doesn't like anything that calls attention to itself, like an overly ornate costume or wig that he thinks competes with the comedy. So it'll be a lot of things like that. He'll say, this one is too long by a minute. He can be withering. Like he'll turn to the writer of a sketch and he'll say, can you take it and make it longer? One night when I was there during the Jonah Hill week, the thing I found funniest is that the musical guest was the young singer-songwriter Maggie Rogers. Yeah. And this, I think, was her television debut. Mm-hmm. I don't even think her first album had come out yet. She shows up on stage at dress wearing this big red caftan and no shoes. And he just takes one look at it. I just saw him wrinkle his face and he said, barefoot? Where's she from? A place with roads? Yeah. He just thought it was so silly and pretentious, So, he's watching the dress rehearsal and then there's a meeting in his office where everybody crams in and they're all squinched in sitting on the floor. And he's like a general at that moment. He's issuing these rapid fire orders. It'll be like, take 97 seconds out of this one, change this, lose that, change the order. And you've never seen anything like it. It's heart pounding because the show is going to go on in half an hour and he's sometimes completely remaking it. So, in terms of the succession, I could imagine a situation where he's home most of the week and he comes in on Wednesday afternoon and he comes in on Saturday afternoon and the rest is left to his very able staff. But, who knows what's going to happen? What do you guys think is going to happen? Do you have theories?
Go ahead, Brad.
No, I don't even pretend to have an idea. No.
I think the lieutenants take a group taking over is more likely than one person kind of running the ship like he does.
And they've been there forever. I mean, Higgins has been there forever now. So it's not like he's got people who don't know how the beast runs.
That's right. And as I say in the book, I got a really up close look at all these people and how they work together and how they work with Lorne. And each one of them has a different strand of what matters to Lorne. Higgins actually, he's got really great in an HR capacity. He's apparently somebody who is often used to tell people if they've been hired or fired. He has this kind of bedside manner. He also has a great deal of silliness, which Lorne likes. Lorne always tries to steer, especially young writers, away from, young people maybe have more of a tendency to want their sketches to have a kind of a cool, indie, gritty, black and white cinema kind of vibe. And one of the things he always likes to say is, no, you want to do it in sunshine. You want to remember that it's comedy. It should look like fun. Fred Armisen mentioned that, it wasn't good to have a coffin in a sketch. I mean, I know they do every now and then, but because, it kind of brings people down. You want to bring people up.
Yeah. I mean, it's these fascinating little insights that they they all get and take and then kind of carry with them forever, it seems, when you hear folks talk about something that they learned from Lorne, in the
Yeah,
80s.
Tina Fey's book, Bossy Pants, which of course is a fantastic book, has a whole
Yes.
chapter called, the things she learned from Lorne. I mean, she studied him, learned a lot of good management techniques from him. But the other thing that I love is that her up close study of Lorne yielded so many facets of the great Jack Donaghy character that Alec Baldwin plays.
Yes.
One of the things that really makes me think of Lorne in 30 Rock is there's an episode where Baldwin is walking around the office in a tuxedo. And Liz Lemon, Tina Fey, looks at him and goes, "Jack, you're in a tux." And he goes, "What's after 6? What am I, a farmer?"
Yes.
It's like the funniest joke of that entire series was that line.
Alec loves to say that Lorne Michaels keeps a tuxedo in his glove compartment. I don't think he's on the charity gala circuit quite as much as he used to be now that he's 80, but he has been on that circuit.
And I gotta say, Susan, I think your book, if it only reinforces that fact that you just mentioned, that Lorne would stick on for some capacity, because one of the things that keeps coming up over and over again is there's just no one else like Lorne. There's no one else who does what he does. So I think if he were to leave the show, and I think he even says it in the book at one point, is this show would never get greenlit today. It's just too expensive. There's too much going on. And I think if he left the show, it wouldn't be SNL as everyone knows it, because it's so much about Lorne. It would be a different show. It'd be like the Steve Higgins show or the Tina Fey show. I don't know if they would really make SNL anymore without his fingerprints on it.
I think that's a really good point. I think it's true. I mean, he compared the show to like a David Lean epic, on television in terms of the expense and the waste, the number of costumes and sets that get trashed every Saturday night at 11 o'clock. But yeah, I mean, one of the things you could see happening is maybe it's a lot more pre-tape. Maybe it's like a lot of please don't destroy videos or little video things that they can sort of do at their leisure. What you really can't see happening without him at the helm is that nail-biting, crazy, going right up to the brink. Because first of all, you need so much charisma and simple power of personality to make everybody fall in like that. But they're great at making pre-tapes. And so many of those directors, Oz Rodriguez, I can't remember the name of the guy who directed the Please Don't Destroy movie. They're really, it's a stable bursting with all kinds of talent. So maybe that would be another way to go, to make it a show of pre-tapes overseen by those deputies. I don't know. I mean, I sure hope it doesn't go away. I know it's a hit for NBC and brings in a lot of revenue. So maybe they would want to do it too. But to speak to something else that you just said, you definitely have the feeling when you're there that Lorne as an eminence is almost more powerful than any executive at NBC or Comcast. I've seen, taking calls from Ted Sarandos or, David Zasloff, asking for advice. And I've been there when, I'm blanking on the name, Brian Roberts. These people are like waiting in Lorne's outer office to get a minute to see him. I mean, these people are his bosses.
Yeah. So. Was there, in all of your communications with folks about this book, was there anything or any story that really surprised you?
Well, I was quite surprised, I mentioned before, about Lorne's initial reluctance to come to New York City to do the show, that he really wanted to stay in California. Gee, let me think about that for a second. I did not know before I started reporting this book that in the mid-90s, when the show was hitting really rough waters, that NBC actually interviewed people with sort of slyly, sneakily looking around to try to replace Lorne. One of the people that they talked to, that they interviewed, was Judd Apatow, who was then a very young producer, director who had done the Ben Stiller show. And I think they wanted to kind of stealthily insert Judd in the mix with the idea that maybe he could take over for Lorne. Now, this was at a time when NBC's management was unusually activist. Many think it's because they had big hits with Friends and Seinfeld, and they were just feeling powerful. Well, and the critics were not liking the show at that time, because the show was sort of moving away from its baby boomer roots. People It was no longer Bill Murray as the lounge singer. It was Adam Sandler and David Spade being these little kind of smart alecky guys. It was a different type of humor. Don Ohlmeyer and other NBC executives really hammered on the show. They made Lorne fire Sandler and fire Farley, eventually made him remove Norm Macdonald from Weekend Update. So the critics and the network were on the same side for the first time ever in the history of the show. Lorne was the odd man out. And, I think it was the only time he really felt that they might just fire him. But again, the thing that's so interesting about Lorne is his calm. He's always thinking 8 steps ahead. Steve Higgins talks about how he's great at playing 3-dimensional chess in his head. He knows it's a long game. His strategy is always just to sort of quietly, calmly wait it out. He has an amazing survival instinct. So he didn't make a fuss or kick and scream or anything when this was all happening. He just figured, I've waited out other administrations. I'll wait out this one. Conan O'Brien is funny about this aspect of Lorne. He'll say, there could be a nuclear holocaust, the world would be over. Lorne would be the last man standing. He'd be there in his office feeding the fish and looking at the cockroaches who have survived with him and saying I see you as a Chevy cockroach. He just has this, real instinct for self-preservation, always staying on the air. I mean, again, this is a little psychobabbly, but I feel like it has to in some way go back to the way he felt that his world collapsed. His dad died when he was 14, and he was determined to just kind of always keep it together, not be taken by surprise, not let the bottom fall out. It's why he's a great producer.
Absolutely. Brad, is there anything else that you wanted to cover?
Final question. As a fan, favorite cast?
Well, Lorne always says that people's favorite casts are the one that was on when they were in high school. And I was in high school during the original cast, so that's a no-brainer. I love them. But just as a journalist, as a biographer, having studied all of it, I think that there are 2 casts that are my favorite. One is the great, Phil Hartman, Carvey, the cast, Jan Hooks, the cast that started around 86. I just think the acting chops on those people were just, they're so funny. Carvey's Bush, Carvey's George Michael impersonation. He's able to make a wilted flower bloom just by holding it near his beautiful bottom, And everything Hooks and Phil Hartman did, I just think was amazing. Yeah. But I also love, because it was kind of cooler and hipper, I love the cast of maybe 10, 15 years ago, the Kristen Wiig, Fred Armisen, Bill Hader, Jason Sudeikis cast. I just thought those people they worked so well together, and they were always having so much fun on stage. And they really had a kind of coolness. Sometimes the whole show has a whiff of nerdiness about it, but that cast I thought was really glamorous and cool.
Yeah, that was a fun cast too. The way that, like you said, they all worked together and had fun together constantly.
Yeah.
It was great.
Yeah.
Susan, thank you so much.
Thank you.
The book, Lorne, the Man Who Invented Saturday Night Live, hits bookshelves today.
Today.
Thank you so much. I love talking about Lorne, especially with SNL geeks like you two.
Yeah.
Really.
And we should say we barely scratched the surface. There, 3 Amigos, the Wayne's World movie, Conan O'Brien, and The Late Show, The Tonight Show. There's so much more stuff in this book. Odds are, if you're listening, you've pre-ordered this and it's coming in the mail today. But if you haven't, go get out there and get it. This book is fantastic.
Phenomenal. Thank you, Susan.
Thank you so much.
Thank
you.
Next week, we're talking about Season 4, Episode 7, with host Walter Matthau. Until then, good night, and have a pleasant tomorrow. Thanks for listening to the Not Ready for Primetime Project. If you're enjoying what you're hearing, please take a moment to rate and review the project wherever you find us. You can also drop us a line to let us know what you liked or didn't, and what else you might like to hear in the future at nr4ptproject@gmail.com. And lastly, you can find us on social media everywhere at nr4pt project. The original music for Deep Thoughts is provided by Jacob Spiewak. The announcer is Jason Taylor. Thanks again for listening. Have a pleasant tomorrow.